Oh. Mm-mm.
Did you see that?
Mhm.
What makes that? Do you know what makes it do that? It's
I have no idea. Gremlin, that's all we can attribute it to.
It's all. And I just
But
clicked on it.
we're gonna go ahead and get started, and people can come in because I have a few announcements, and folks will kind of drizzle in, drop in. First, I want to say good evening to everyone and welcome to the Crummell Cooper chapter of UBE's latest edition in our Knowing Your History series. And this evening, we are blessed and hallelujah proud to have Deborah Nelson Linck with us. She is the author of Pauli Murray, Shouting for the Rights of All People. Deborah, how are you this evening?
I'm great. Thanks so much for inviting me.
It is so good to have you with us this evening. But before we start, before we delve right into this book, I have a couple of announcements. On Tuesday, April 25th at 7 p.m. online, we will have the Reverend Canon Robert Phillips, who will be talking about his book, A Space for Grace, Pathways from Brokenness to Beauty. How do we find space for grace for ourselves in the church in these very troubling and sometimes trying times? And then on Sunday, May 7th at 4 p.m., we are going to have our commemoration. We're restarting our commemoration of Absalom Jones with a service at Trinity Episcopal Church at 8005 Patty Branch Road, Northwest in DC. Bishop Marianne will be the celebrant, and we have a dynamic 32-year-old preacher, Pastor Claudia Marion Allen of Brinklow Seventh-day Adventist Church. She can preach the roof off and then rebuild it and preach it off again. So we're inviting you to that. And then on Saturday, May 20th at 2 p.m., also online, Angelique Nelson, the author of For the Culture, a genealogy handbook for the cool kids. Also continuing with our theme of knowing who we are, what our history is, because we see there are folks who believe that we have no history worth knowing. And if you don't know your history, you can and will be erased. So she'll be with us to talk about her book. And then we have a couple of other things coming on later in May and June, but it's all in line in really recovering, discovering, just holding on to our history of being Black in America. And so this evening, Deborah and I will be in conversation. And if there are questions, you can either place them in the chat or you can raise your hand once we get to that part. But Deborah, this book is for young people.
Yes, yes.
Yes, but as I was reading, I was taking notes, I would have gotten spanked and school, because I write in books, right? I was making notes all over it. I mean, it's a great introduction to the life of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, and you deal with some difficult subjects that in some states just might be on the banned book list. Right?
I
So-
was just mentioning to someone that I was hoping that I would make the proud people who have joined the banned book club. And so there are difficult subjects in there, but I continue to hear adults say, how come I didn't learn that in school? How come I don't know that? Where are, who are these people that I've never heard of? And so because I worked as an educator for so long with very young children, that was the perfect place to me to start with this education of African Americans. And it's amazing how much information very young children, and I taught kindergarten, and I did Black history lessons in kindergarten. And so I would always choose people that the kids had never heard of. And so we would learn about people that way. And when I was asked to write this book, I was like, yeah, I could do that. I'd love to do that. I'd love to introduce everyone to Pauli Murray. So, so that's how that kind of got started.
So tell us a little bit about who you are. I mean, why are you interested in this? What got you interested? How is it to be a writer?
Oh, wow. I always forget that that's a thing that I am. I have loved, I'm going to start way back, and I loved writing in school. And I won a contest in 7th grade. I wrote a radio script. We had a public school radio station that was collecting scripts from just anybody that was in elementary school. And I wrote a script and I won an award. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. So I wrote another script and they accepted it and I won another award. And I was like, I really like to write. So both of my parents are from Memphis, and they always talked Black history things growing up. Not necessarily just people that they knew. They were both well-read, both educated people. So I got a lot of information from growing up and my parents and growing up in church. And then in 8th grade, there was a project that we were supposed to do. And we were supposed to, it was the same project that kids are still doing today. And it's write a story about, a famous African-American and tell us about this famous African-American. And I started digging, and instead of writing this one little paper, I came out with this book that was like this thick. And it was so cool. I mean, I just couldn't get enough. And that book I still have. It's a little scrapbook with lots of things plagiarized in it and pictures that I had drawn and clippings from Ebony magazine and, a Black Panther newspaper and everything. And that was just, I could not get enough. Fast forward, I started teaching and I was in a predominantly white school district. And I asked, what do you all do for Black History Month? And they laughed. And I was like, no, but really, what do you do for Black History Month? And the answer was nothing. So I started trying to introduce information to my school community. And so I started this little thing that I call my Black History Hands-On Museum. So I'd introduce the kids to different figures and we'd have little artifacts that the kids could touch and explore and everything. And then after I retired, I was still sharing that information with teachers on how they could bring more diversity into their classrooms. And so I was still working on that, still putting up displays at church for Black History Month and bringing in speakers. And it's just kind of like that's grown into finally someone asking, hey, would you write a book on Pauli Murray? And I'd love to. So that's the short answer.
That is the short, you start off, you start off right in the front with the use of pronouns in this book. That would have gotten you on the banned book list.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
before you even started getting into the book, just how you were coming to use she, and then you switched to they. Why was that important?
Because I was writing this book for children that are growing up now. And I accept the fact that their world looks different than the world that I grew up in, as far as pronoun usage, as far as them knowing information about people who are different and people who are, I mean, our families look different now. Our friend circles, our churches, our everything looks different. Their world looks different. And so they have this knowledge, and to not acknowledge the fact that people are beginning to use pronouns for what people want to be called and want to be identified as in a respectful way. I had to put that in there. Otherwise, my book would be instantly outdated. It would be like using old language. And so I was like, and I struggle with that. You know, we're creatures of habit. And so if you look like this, you're a girl. If you look like this, you're a boy. And that's not how the world is.
Right.
And so is helping them to see that the kids, younger kids, it flows out of their mouths automatically. And for us, we're the ones that are given that second thought. So what I did was I have a couple of trans friends and asked them, what do I do about this pronoun usage? The best information I got, or the best advice I got, was pick and stick and be able to defend what you did. And I was like, okay, then I'll do that. So the other thing that went into the book is trying to be true to Pauli's voice, to her authentic voice. So one of my research pieces was to listen to an oral history that she had done. That was a 6-hour history. And so I listened to that with her real voice. And I watched some videos with her real voice. And Pauli described themselves as always she and her. And I suspect because that's what she had access to. But also it was like, I need to stay true to that time and who they described themselves as. But then to show that change when Pauli was discovering themselves, to change the pronoun usage at that part of the book. So when she went away to college, when all of us are exploring who we are and finding ourselves, then that seemed like the logical place to put that pronoun usage, which suggested that there was something that was changed about them at that part of the book without naming it, just putting it out there so that it was changed.
Thank you for that. You know, this book to me is at once a biography, but also a social critique. Because there's the, you provide the history of society, of how it was segregated, and there's, discrimination against women. How did you decide to incorporate all of that into a book that is 53 pages long?
So again, in telling this story, I think a lot of times when you have biographies on people for young children, you're just given, this happened then, and you throw out the word Jim Crow, you throw out the word segregation, you throw out civil rights, and they don't have any sense of a timeline of when things happened. So part of the storytelling is to tell that timeline kind of and mixed in with her story. So, for example, when Pauli was arrested with her friend on the bus, it wasn't just another Rosa Parks moment. This happened way before Rosa Parks. This happened in helping children to understand. This was 15 years before Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin.
Mhm.
And then I mean, again, research told me that this was something that had happened to Frederick Douglass. And beyond that, so there were others in history. So history happens on this timeline. And I kind of wanted to tell that timeline through the story as kind of background. An interesting thing that happened is in the back of the book, there's a timeline of events.
Mhm.
So it's like,
Mhm.
this is what happened. And then this is where Pauli was at this time, or this is the contribution she made at this time. And that was interesting. The editor said, oh, a timeline would be great. That would be really interesting in the book. And then they said, well, pick out 6 things that you think were like key things that happened in history, that we could use as a timeline. And I said, that's ridiculous. She was born in 1910. She died in 1985. I was like, I can't make it that short. So I made, and they kind of helped me along with that part of it. But it was just like, kids need to understand that, because kids, if you ask kids history, there's slavery. And then something happened. And then Martin Luther King came along. And then some other stuff happened. And then we got a Black president. And along the way, there were some other folks. Yeah, Harriet Tubman helped free the slaves, and Rosa Parks sat down, and that's our history.
Mhm.
And it's like, no, we need to discover, and then what happened, and fill in those blanks.
Right.
And hopefully the way that I told the story helped fill in some of those blanks
Mhm.
and help you think about history doesn't happen in isolation. Acts don't happen. They're all part of a timeline that eventually we get there because this person put in the work.
Right, right. And you also include a glossary
Mhm, mhm.
in addition to the timeline.
We throw words at kids and we expect them to be on our level and understand when I say segregation, of course, you know what that means. And for very young children, they don't. And they
Mhm.
won't ask you a question about it because you've said it and I should know what it is. And so I'm going to pretend like I know what it is and I'll never ask. And God forbid that a child should pick up a dictionary anymore and look something up, or, look something up online. They don't. So I wanted them to have the words right there.
Mhm.
So it's like, somebody's talking about segregation. What is that again? Somebody's talking about Jim Crow. Where did that come from? What is that? I remember in a friend of mine, Paula Shelton, wrote a book, and her father is Andrew Young.
Mm.
And Paula said when she grew up, she thought Jim Crow was this big crow. And here her father is friends with Martin Luther King, and she's like, but to her as a kid, Jim Crow was like a bunch of mean crows that would get you if you didn't do this or didn't follow this plan or
Right,
whatever. So kids have all
right,
kinds of things in their heads unless we replace that with the knowledge that they should have about it.
right. I mean, that makes perfect sense. We just assume that they know. Even some
Mhm.
of us aren't clear on it. As you conclude the book, because I always go to the end and then I go to the front, then I go to the middle, then I sit down and read the book, right? You use Pauli Murray's words. It says, when my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. When they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. What is she saying there?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
What is she saying there with that quote?
I just think that what she's saying in that statement is a statement about her life.
Mhm.
Pauli was always about including all of us, all of mankind, all of this. And she struggled with that inequity throughout her life. And Pauli Murray was a person that was always just like fighting that uphill battle that she chose. And this statement was so her. It was, if this happens, I'm going to do this. If you're not going to include people, I'm going to say that all people need to be included. And that's who they were. And so that quote was perfect. Now, I will tell you that I put the quote in there to tie in with, of course, the title of the book. But the title of the book was not my original title.
And it was?
My original title was that I fell in love with, and it was really hard to make a switch. But my title was Pauli Murray, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. And is that reading from Psalms that just captured them exactly to me. And I had a very different path that I was following with the book when I started out. So as a cradle Episcopalian, what I saw as important, an important story to tell, because there are lots of stories to tell about anybody's life, but I saw as important because Bishop Delaney had laid hands on her and told Pauli, you're a child of destiny. And it seemed to me that Pauli was a person that leaned into their baptismal vows. And so was starting with the psalm and then talking about how they lived into their baptismal vows and then building the story around that was my original thought for the book. But the funny thing is, I share this, I'll probably get my wrist slapped at some point. Church Publishing said, it's too churchy. And that's why they changed the title. It was too churchy.
Okay, too churchy. Okay, that's interesting.
I know. And too churchy in that people who are the unchurched would be excluded from this. But my understanding and what I pushed back with, and I said, this is not a book that's proselytizing, but it's a book that's welcoming people in and telling them who we are as Episcopalians. Now, you can read about what someone does without being that thing that the person is talking about. We can read about an airplane pilot or a doctor, anything else, and not be that and have an appreciation for that.
Right.
But it was too churchy. They changed the title and they said, do you like this title or this title? And mine was not a choice. And so that was my first hard thing to swallow.
Hey, but it is about an Episcopal priest. She does have a collar on.
Yes,
I guess that's not too churchy.
I know. I'm like,
So Pauli Murray was born up the road a piece from us in Baltimore, right? So tell us a little about her early life, her childhood.
So bless her heart, she had a really sad kind of a combination kind of childhood. So Pauli was born in 1910, and at the age of 3, her mom kind of had kids in rapid succession. And so I think her mom had 5 or 6 kids, like pretty close together. Yeah. And the doctors had warned her mother that if she had any more kids, it was too much stress on her body, then, she could be very ill or not survive that pregnancy. And sure enough, she was pregnant with another baby and had that baby, and she died shortly after. And so there were these 5 kids that the father was left to handle. And he was not able to do that. He was an educator, and it was a lot. There was a lot of stress put on the father. And so he doled the kids out to family members. And so the Pauli's brothers and sisters went with one of the aunts. And then Pauli's Aunt Pauline asked her at the age of 3 or 4, who do you want to live with?
Mm.
That's a
Mm.
huge question for a little person.
Mm-hmm.
And Pauli answered, I want to live with you. So Pauli went to live by herself
Mm-hmm.
with her aunt and her grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And actually there were 2 aunts in the home at the time. So they lived. So the father had mental health issues after that and was placed in an asylum. And he was beat to death
Mm.
in the asylum. And so Pauli had visited him. I can remember one visit that she had with her father, and the next time she saw him again, he was dead.
Mm. Mm.
So she had like really vivid memories of them bringing the body to the house for the wake and
Yeah.
everything. So that was a really, really hard life. But then she grew up in the home with her grandparents and her aunts, and her aunt took her to school with her because she didn't have anything to do with her. No daycare, no, there wasn't a
No
thing. There
kindergarten,
was
no
kindergarten,
pre-K.
not a thing.
Right.
And at first she could participate in class, but then the other parents were upset that she was participating and she wasn't school age. So she just kind of had to sit by herself. And she was just absorbing everything that went, into this classroom that her aunt was teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when she learned to read. And she's like, I can read this. And her aunt took her aside and gave her a different book than they had been using. And she read it. And she was like, oh, okay. And so, she begins her school career, and she's really bright, and she's reading the Bible to grandparents at home. She has this amazing school life where she's top of the class, but she has energy, and she protests things as a young child. She's outspoken, and she was blessed with this Aunt Pauline who loved her unconditionally.
Mm-hmm.
We should all live so long
Also long.
as to have anyone in our lives that will love us unconditionally.
Unconditionally, yeah.
And so that was part of her upbringing, and that's kind of her young life was.
Right. In reading, I said there's some things in here that would shock our kids. For example, she had a job at the age, a real job, a paying job at the age of 10.
Mm-hmm,
and when she was home, she stacked wood that was used to warm the house, filled oil lamps. I actually have one of those oil lamps, but I can imagine kids like, what do you mean an oil lamp? Of course, why didn't you just turn on the electricity, right? She had to scrub the outhouse. Can you
the outhouse, not even the bathroom, the
right,
outhouse.
Right. The outhouse. She worked in the garden, and of course there was no telephone. Our kids go around with these cell phones. Imagine not even having not even the kind that some of us knew that had a party line, and everybody was on the same. There absolutely was none. So she initially went to segregated schools, and she noticed the difference between her school and the white schools. How did that make her feel?
She walked past that school every day, and she could see kids playing out front, and there was, this beautiful schoolyard and everything. And here they were passing that school to go to their school with the worn out books that were torn and ripped. And, just the injustice of that was all too much for her. But even when she reaches high school and, school is a bit farther for her, she continues to walk to school because the buses are segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So, and, she used her money from a job to buy a bicycle so that she could deliver papers, but also she could use the bike to ride to school. So just always thinking about that. And I'm like, that's amazing. But one of the things I did discover that was really kind of interesting was there's the part in the book that talks about when Pauli graduated at the top of her class from high school.
Mm-hmm.
She's got this scholarship to Wilberforce, and she loves the teachers from Wilberforce. They're one of the first teachers to come out that had been trained, that had been college trained. And so they were these bright people and bringing all these ideas to these young kids. But she decides, I don't want to go to a segregated school. And so I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to go to Columbia. And that's my plan. So her aunt indulges her and takes her there. So there's the whole part of the story that talks about that, but then they talk about how she doesn't have enough high school credits to graduate. What I found in the research was that a lot of Black schools only went to grade 11. And so there was not an expectation for Blacks to go any further than that. Like you really had to be doing something to make it to grade 11. And so that's why there was the need for Pauli to take extra courses at Hillside in New York. Now, the interesting thing with that is it was like 30 or 40 years later that they started to put in that 12th grade element in a lot of the Black schools. And this is part of the history of HBCUs. They started the schools, in many cases to help and support Black students who hadn't had that same advantage of white children that had gone through 12th grade and then gone on to a 4-year college. And the HBCUs were kind of picking up that slack and doing that. So I found that really interesting. That didn't make it in the book, but it was interesting.
Well, you did talk about it only went to the 11th grade. So then she had to do makeup courses before she finally went to Hunter College instead of, because Columbia did not admit Black folk.
No.
Right.
And Pauli didn't know that until they got there, and it was like, oh, okay. So, but didn't give up on any of that. Did that whole year. They said that this will take you 2 years to complete these courses. Pauli finishes it in 1 year, and after 1 year goes back home because she's out of money and she has to work. And so that they'll have enough money to go back to college full time. So so many of those things along the way would have knocked any of us down. Right. And that would have been the end of our story, is that I tried to go to college and I couldn't, but they were so determined that this was the path for them to be on, that, I need this college education. And that was the way of a lot of Black folks, my parents included, in that they saw education as a way out of poverty. So
and her name was Anna Pauline, right? Her name is Anna Pauline. So after she goes through all of this and she's in her young adult years, she changes her name to Pauli. So and she's discovering herself.
They're discovering themselves, and they are doing things that are not traditional at the time. So women wore dresses, and women wore dresses for a long time. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when we could wear dresses to public school. I mean, wear pants to public school. And it was a big deal. And it wasn't, you couldn't wear jeans, but you could wear pants or some kind of pantsuit or an outfit. And that was in the, telling on myself, 60s, late 60s.
It was 69, I remember.
There we go. And I was like, oh my gosh, but back then, Pauli was wearing pants and they liked their hair short. So Pauli would cut their hair really short and wear the short do. But Pauli played the game too. Because, I mean, if you look at pictures of them, here they are with the short hair, but with pearls, with a suit on, with all these different, they were playing the game and they understood that. But the interesting thing that I found about Pauli Murray was, even though they had this internal struggle, even though they had gone to a doctor to ask about hormone therapy, which was
Mm,
not a thing in the 40s.
mm-mm,
Even my friend who's trans and had hormone therapy in the 80s said that it was really difficult at that point in her life. And so, let alone in the 40s, this was not something that was done. And so, even with the internal struggle, they continued to be who they were. And people understood who they were, and they just accepted it. They didn't name it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't ever over discuss. You know, in the documentary that's on Amazon about Pauli, they asked these men, did you know, these had been students of hers, did you know that, you know, there was something going on, that she was a non-binary person? And they were like, yeah. And they said, did you know because, you know, Pauli told you? Nope. They said, we just knew.
mhm.
And it wasn't because her girlfriend was living there. It wasn't because, you know, they had a reputation or anything. They just knew. But they accepted that this person was so super smart and there was so much to learn from them that they just ignored that. It was like, okay, whatever. I just need to learn from you. I need to learn at your feet. So
Mhm, mhm,
that
mhm.
was a thing.
So they graduate from Hunter College, and they want to become a writer. And so Pauli spends a lot of time writing poetry, and then Pauli wants to use writing skills to protest unfair laws. I mean, you got Jim Crow, you got Jane Crow.
Mhm.
And in fact, Pauli wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because they disagreed with a speech that he had given. Now, he didn't write back to her, but Eleanor Roosevelt writes back to
Mhm.
Pauli, right? And there's a friendship there because Pauli is invited to the residence, and there is a relationship between Pauli and Eleanor Roosevelt. So I mean, think about that. You know, you have a Black person who can kind of waltz into the White House. Of course, waltzing into the White House wasn't as difficult as it is today. You can actually waltz into the White House. You know, if you were invited, you knocked on the door and you were let in. But this was something unusual for that time. And the fact that a Black person had entree to the White House and the First Lady. So how, you know, did they parlay that into anything?
That was so I was listening to another oral history just recently because I visited Valkill, which was Eleanor Roosevelt's space that she had down the road from where the Roosevelts grew up, where she and her kids and FDR lived. But she had this separate property and she would entertain there, and she and FDR entertained there, but mostly it was Eleanor's place. But the interesting thing about this friendship that they had, there was a 15-year difference between the women. So Eleanor Roosevelt was 15 years her senior. And what the original letter, as I understand, was in protest of, so FDR was carrying on about how wonderful University of North Carolina was and how liberal they were and how great thinking they were and everything. And Pauli was incensed because she had tried to go to UNC and it was denied that. And so, knowing that this letter is not going to go anywhere, writes this letter and kind of says some snarky stuff in it and is telling the president, in effect, that that's not the issue. That's not the biggest issue for Black people then, is this college and all this. That the biggest issue for them at the time was the problem with lynching. And so through whatever channels, the president chooses not to answer this, passes the letter on, and the letter gets in the hands of Eleanor, who then responds. And Eleanor says, yes, progress is slow, but you have to be patient, which is not a thing that anybody said to Pauli. So she fires off another letter to her. So there's this relationship between them through letter writing that lasts for many, many years. But they start to mold each other, and they start to influence each other. So Eleanor can see that Pauli's this young, fiery, militant woman, and that there's something to be learned from her and her experience with being a Black person and, you know, in America. And Eleanor has this position of power because she has the president's ear.
Right.
And so the letters go back and forth until finally Pauli has written a letter to her, single space, typewritten, that's like 5 pages long. Eleanor writes back, I want to see you at the White House. And it's kind of like a command, you know, you come to me. So then she's afraid. Pauli gets a little like, uh-oh, thinking that she's crossed the line. And she takes a friend of hers with her, and it's a great reception. She hugs her and welcomes her into the space, and they, you know, they listen to each other and they hear each other. And just over the years, Pauli talks about watching Eleanor change and her heart change and her thoughts change about things. And she knows it's partially because of her and her thoughts about, she was not a big supporter of FDR, but she had this tremendous amount of respect for Eleanor Roosevelt and how she used her position. And they really didn't become friends until after he passed.
Okay.
And then they worked on they had some committee work together that they could be on a different level with each other. But every time something happened, she continued to like send her these fiery letters. And Eleanor would snap back and say, now look, you know. And then Pauli would say, no, you don't understand. I mean, it was just really, and to have that kind of what she called chutzpah,
yes,
to speak to the first lady in that way, but she felt like she had every right as a public servant that was serving her, you know, and her needs. Then, so that it was a very interesting relationship.
Well, it seems that her life has prepared her for other opportunities to display chutzpah, because then she decides she's going to go to law school, and she applies and is accepted at Howard Law. Thurgood Marshall writes a recommendation letter for her. Ends up being 2 women in her class. But what happens? You know, you think you're among your people, right? This should be a little bit easier. But what happens?
Pauli thought, okay, at last I'm with my people. They're going to support me. They're going to have my back. I'm going to study. I'm going to do all the stuff with them. A college professor says in front of the class, I don't know why women are even trying to be lawyers. And Pauli's like, with most things, takes this as a challenge. I'll show you why women need to be lawyers. And, you know, one of her favorite things that they would repeat over and over again was, don't get mad, get smart. And they were just like a brilliant person and could, you know, had this capacity for learning and taking in information. So the other woman drops from the program, and then Pauli then floats to the top of the class and gains the respect of fellow classmates. And they see how brilliant she is. And so she's gained their respect. And with going to Howard, one of the things that would happen after you graduated at the top of your class is that you could apply to Harvard to enter Harvard. But Harvard was like, nah, we don't take women. So it was just like, all these doors just kept opening and slamming and opening and slamming throughout her life.
Right.
But that's during the time when she was at Howard that she discovers that Black people are discriminating against her because she's a woman. So it's gender discrimination. And that's what she's like, this is like Jim Crow only for women. So it's Jane Crow. And that's where that term came from.
So he says, don't even get smart. So she can't get to Harvard. So she ends up University of California, Berkeley, where she gets a master's degree. And then she goes to Yale, where she's the first African-American student to receive a JSD, a Doctor of the Science of Law. So, I mean, she's going to stack up, they're going to prove that, no, I've got the smarts wherever I need to be. In your book, you talk about how they also are one of the founders of the National Organization for Women, which, some people might not even know that, but they were on the ground for that.
So one of the interesting things about that organization is here all these women got together and just like we need to meet, we need to say, our voices need to be heard. And so they formed this organization and they're working for women's rights. And it's another organization that Pauli gets into, and this happens to her several times throughout her life. But because of the Now program, she's like, okay, we're talking about this about women, this about women. Now was more interested in the struggles of middle-class women, middle class, specifically white women. And they weren't as interested in the plight of Black women and their specific problems, problems that were just for them. And so the umbrella was not wide enough. It was not inclusive enough. So she quit. That's when she stopped working with them. She's like, nope,
I'm out of here.
She would go and put her energy in something else. As long as a cause was there and it was moving in the direction that Pauli saw it, making progress, it was good. If it was not, nope. And would go in a different direction and get in another organization, and not as a quitter, but just not moving in the direction that they felt the country needed to move in, with the issues that were important to them. Pauli was also part of the women's group that were participating in the March on Washington, and was upset because they wouldn't give women a stronger role in that. The women had done all this work in preparation for the March on Washington, and then the men got all the glory. And in fact, in another research project I did one time, I found there was a separate march for women at the March on Washington, that the women came down a different street than the men. So the men almost missed the march, they missed the start of the march because they're in talking to the president. And then the women are doing their thing over here. So you may notice like in footage of the march when people are talking, and Martin Luther King, who's a little known person at that time, he was growing in popularity, but he wasn't the Martin Luther King that we recognize with all the accomplishments at that point. But Pauli and Baird Rustin kind of butted heads over women need to speak at this march. And there's a select group of women that were there. Was Josephine Baker was one of the women, Daisy Bates was another one. But there was this really small group of women, and they decided that only 2 or 3 of the women could speak for a very short time.
Surprised they didn't rush up and take the mic.
I know, right?
But then she they have another source, another outlet, and that is their writing. And I can't imagine. She, wrote the states' rights on race and color, 746 pages.
And they asked for a pamphlet.
Right,
They
right.
asked for a pamphlet of this information. And I don't know if this is still going on, but for years after that particular thing was published, the book was continuing to be edited. As
Mm,
more information was available, they would add to it and add to it. This was years after she passed.
mhm,
Add to it. So I don't know what the last year, because it had anecdotal stories in it. It had what specific things were in there. And the amazing thing about this, once again, if you think about, we look at history with the eyes of today, so
mhm.
it's hard for us to imagine then. There were no computers back then.
No,
So this
no.
was on the ground research, that somebody's
Mhm,
digging through books. Now, the other interesting thing about this information that she gathered was the people who wrote the laws were very deliberate in how they wrote them, and that they didn't mention race in them.
mhm.
So they would describe a group of people, Black people, but they would use descriptive things and say persons that blah, 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 may not, whatever the law was. And so in researching this, you could miss a lot of stuff. So just say today, if I did it on a computer, I could type in laws discriminating on race,
Mhm.
and all this stuff would pop up, right? Because you have those words to put in. Because they didn't mention race in those things, they were difficult to find in any law book that Pauli would go through. So that's why it had holes in it. And as that information became more clear over the years, they edited the book. But that's amazing that somebody to write this little tiny book was just, was all this research that I had done
Right.
and condensed into this little book. Because like I said, there are so many stories and so many directions you could take this. But a book that's 700 pages long is just amazing, amazing.
And the thing about it, didn't that the research form the base or help those folks like Thurgood Marshall who
Mhm,
were arguing the 1954 school desegregation case.
mhm, mhm,
So
mhm,
it became like a Bible for them,
So
written
a
by
lot of the work
this
that
this
Pauli
person.
did was foundational. It was
Yeah.
just, the foundation for so many different things, because she would just put it out there, and this is what's going to happen with this, and this is, if this law says this, and and it came to pass. I mean, it always did. And Pauli was not the person that needed accolades and awards and, for people to dote on her about her accomplishments. She was just like ever moving forward. She was
Mhm.
pushing her race forward. She was pushing her folks forward and doing what was best and inclusive for everybody. And it was without all that. And when it happened, she was like, okay, I'll take the award. But it was never
Mhm.
about that. It was never about that.
Mhm. Mhm. And so then in later life, the book talks about their partner Irene, and how Irene got ill and died. And then Pauli, I don't know if it's then or kind of like concurrent. Pauli decides, okay, I need a change of career.
Well,
So, you know.
so her relationship, she had been with Irene for 16 years,
Mhm,
and they had actually met at a law firm. And so they had this relationship and discovered that, they were like-minded in many
mhm,
ways, and were both Episcopalians, and would go to church services on their lunch break. That was like a thing for them. And so the two women never lived together. They had separate places that they live, but they vacation together, they own dogs together, they do like all of these things together. So they were a couple back then. That's what a couple would look like back then. And this was at the end of Irene's life, when she was back and forth to the hospital when Irene was ill, and it was so hard for her because they had such a long relationship. But it was the second time in her life that she had said last rites over a person when they were dying. So she was reading to her from the Book of Common Prayer and offered these prayers before Irene passed. And that, and I think it was her aunt was the other person. I need to go back and look at that. But so she had these two profound things that had happened, and she was there, and Pauli realized that meant something, that she was able to be there for those people in their passing. And her understanding of how far she could go with sharing the law and dealing with the law and helping people through the law, that was one route, but there was something else. And she started to think about how will they spend their remaining days? How will they spend the rest of their life? And because church and spirituality and religion had been a part of her life always, it was always, even when she got mad with the church and walked out with the women in the church, even with all that, it was still an important part of their life. And so they turned to the Episcopal Church at age 66, and started yet another, process of learning to be a priest.
So she starts seminary in 1973, in which they are the oldest person in class. And I always tell people I stand on Pauli Murray's shoulders, because I entered seminary about 60, something like that. But you can do it. And of course, they had to retire at 72. So 6 years she was in the active, what we call active priesthood. Of course, she when they retired, still a priest. But to make that switch, and of course, the church probably wasn't all that happy at that particular age. Like, what are you going to do? You've got 6 years to retirement. Who's going to call you, because you can't stay long. So probably there's that whole conversation that went on, plus being in seminary, and of course being around white males, the predominant student group, and then being the oldest.
And there's a story that I read about her in school. She had another female friend that was, in seminary as well. And her friend had to tell her at one point, you need to give other people a chance to answer questions, because you're kind of abrupt and you're cutting people off, and, people can't answer. And Pauli realizes, she's like, I thought that, that they were finished talking. They realize they have a hearing problem. And so she gets hearing aids, and then like, oh, these are all the things I've been missing. So even with the aging process, she wasn't deterred from doing that thing that she felt strongly she was called to do. And it's interesting because Pauli talks about being called to the priesthood, even though that wasn't a thing when she entered seminary. There were no women that she was looking up to that were ordained, but felt really strongly and was very outspoken at St. Mark's, where they attended, about how few women participated in the service at all. And so just this force of nature, so one of the things that I did in research, I was reading a book, and I came across St. Mark's in the Bowery where she had attended. And I was like, wait, I know something about that church. I know somebody that was the priest there. So I keep reading, and they mention the priest's name, which is Michael Allen.
Mm.
And I thought, wait a minute, this can't be the same Michael Allen I know. When Michael Allen left St. Mark's in the Bowery, he came to St. Louis to Christ Church Cathedral to be the dean of the cathedral.
Mm.
Michael Allen was who married me. And so he has passed and his wife has passed, but I'm friends with his daughter. So his daughter said, I have a friend that you may know, Nell Gibson. And Nell was Michael Allen's secretary. And so Sarah told me, she said, she probably talked to Pauli because she's probably in and out of the office for this and that.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked to Nell, and she was like, oh yeah, I remember her.
Mm.
So it was like I was getting that close to history.
Right, right.
Finding out these connections, which is my favorite part of history, that of how everybody's connected eventually somewhere. And so we had this really interesting conversation, but she talked about Pauli was a small framed person, but had this presence when she walked in the room.
Mm.
That she was always like, she stood up straight, and just there was a presence. She said Irene was very sweet. She remembered Irene and said that Pauli was sometimes just a little prickly, but was just like a no nonsense person, I guess, very much like her aunt.
Mm.
So, but had some memories of her. And then my friend dug through some of her dad's paperwork and found Pauli Murray's name on some of the church documents. So that was exciting for nerd me.
Oh, this has been so interesting, and I'm going to give a few minutes if people have questions. But as you in the book, when Pauli celebrates her first service, you write that she goes to the Chapel of the Cross, the church where, and this is in North Carolina, so Chapel of the Cross, where their enslaved grandmother had been baptized. So that connection, and just thinking about that. And then there's something that's not in the book. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was going before the Supreme Court to argue her case in the matter of sex, that Pauli Murray helped her prepare to argue that case. So there's another connection.
Yes.
So Pauli's all over the place.
Absolutely. And which is so interesting for a person that you would know so little about. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, they had their hand in this, and they had their hand in this, and they, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg gives Pauli credit for writing, this review, that there's information in there that she can use for this court case. And so she reckons, she's like, I couldn't have done this without this work that Pauli, and there was another lawyer, had put into this. But this big a character that has touched so many different things in the time that they grew up is just, that was a fascinating thing to me. It's like, how could you just be this powerful a person? I mean, and have survived all of this, just survived it brilliantly. Pauli had bouts of depression and was hospitalized for malnutrition because they were just so driven that, eating was sometimes talked about how little sleep she needed, and it was just one of those people that knew that there was a purpose for her life, that knew that there was work to be done, that took the responsibility of being a person that could help their race. And and make the world just a little bit better, a little bit different, a little bit more inclusive. Just ran with that. And that's to be admired.
Just a fantastic life. Obstacles being thrown left and right from the very beginning. Just like she just, jump over it and go to the next one.
And just go to the next thing.
Or
Go to the next thing.
Or one door closed. They didn't wait for another door to open. They built the door. and went through it. So as we come to a close, before I ask you for, final comments, and I would suggest, everybody needs to buy this book, read it, then buy another one or several to give to all the young people and read it with them. Have a discussion about Pauli Murray. It's a small book, but it is packed with so much information.
Thank you.
It is. It is packed with so much information, and it's written in a way that young people can understand. And it doesn't shy away from tough topics.
No.
They're written in a way that they can understand, that they will be able to ask questions. And if you've read it before you give it to them, you will be able to answer. So are there any questions? You can unmute yourself, raise your hand. As we,
I'm about to bust over here.
Go ahead, Doris.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ms. Linck. I saw the movie, but what you're saying, brought the warmth out. The movie was cold, fat documentary, but you're talking about it made it warm, made it, just so personal and inward, spiritual, I should say. But I knew of Pauli Murray. I'm an old person, but I didn't know. I'm like the youngsters. I did not know that she had done all these things. I remember as a young person coming into the Episcopal Church that I met her. She came to St. Monica's Church. She was in Baltimore at the time. And she came to St. Monica's Church, and Harold Lewis was the rector there at that time. And I met her, and when I found out that this was the person, I said, well, now, how did she get past me with all of this? And I did not know it. Thank you so very much. And the next thing is, where do I get that book? Do I get it from the church publishing or Amazon or what, the book?
All of the above. Church publishing has copies of it, and Amazon has it as well.
Okay, because as I said, I did see the movie, but it was fine, and I loved it. But your explanations of things and in-depth was worth everything to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
It truly was.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we ask for final comments? Well, hearing none, I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. And as we close, Deborah, final words?
Final words. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I would encourage everybody to share this book with young folks. I've jokingly said that this is a Cliff Note book for older adults, which is fine. But this is a fascinating, inspiring person that anybody can continue. Here I was retired for many years now and ready to sit down. And I'm so happy I was able to study about her and be inspired so that I could keep going a little bit further. And I'm just so proud that to be in the same church as Pauli, and for her to have made this pathway for all of us. And just an amazing, amazing woman.
Amen. 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 Well, again, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for my personalized copy that I have written all over.
Yay.
I did. I made underlined notes in the margin because I knew about Pauli, but then I've read a couple of books. But this, as Doris said, this brought out the warmth It really, really did. It brought out the warmth. It like Pauli was right there.
Mhm.
You could
Thank you.
grab her hand and walk with her. So to be able to share this book with young people in and out of the church,
Yes.
so that during Black History Month, they have more than the usual suspects.
Yes.
You know, the
Yes.
same 4 plus add Martin Luther King that we had when we were in school. You know? But again, thank you all who attended, those of you who are listening online. Thank you, Deborah, for number 1, writing this and then spending time with us. And so we're just going to wait for the next book.
All righty. And I am taking suggestions.
So if there's anybody you want to read about, send them Deborah's way.
Please.
Send them Deborah's way. So again, thanks everyone, and have a blessed rest of the evening. Again,
All righty.
take care. Bye-bye.